Debt is something that is owed or due, a state of owing money.
Okay, so first we have to separate the ideas of debt and deficit. Debt is the total amount of our outstanding liabilities. Deficit, or occasionally surplus, is the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in. Right?
Each year, the government receives money from households and corporations in the form of taxes and other revenues. It then spends that money in the economy on public services and other commitments. If the government wants to spend more money than its revenues, it has to borrow the difference. It does this by issuing debt securities, IOUs. Investors buy them, the government gets the money it needs, and investors receive interest. But when the outstanding debt gets too large, investors start to worry that they won't get their money back. This is where the central bank comes in. The central bank lowers interest rates, which basically means that it prints money until interest rates hit its target. Satisfied that their investments are safe, investors keep buying government IOUs, which means that the government gets to keep spending more than it earns. Sounds great, right? Well, there's a catch. Over time, continual interest rate suppression and money printing sets up an inescapable trap.
So you can't really think of government debt the same way you'd think about like a family owing money to a credit card company, because in that situation, the family owes money to someone else. But in the case of US government debt, we mostly, indirectly or directly, owe money to ourselves.
Reinhardt and Rogoff did a study that shows that annual growth after inflation averaged at 3.5% among countries with central government debt below 90% of GDP in previous years, and 2.5% among countries above a 90% average GDP. Kumar and Wu look at 5-year averages and report that high debt advanced economies grew 1.3 percent points slower annually than their low debt, below 30%, counterparts. Kumar and Wu note that the negative effects of debt build steadily as debt grows from 30% to 90%. At intermediate debt levels, debt drag is already substantial. These authors found the same negative effects on economic growth from high debt levels.
Secondly, you may have heard people say the government should be run like a business. It should never spend more than it takes in. Yeah, no, that is not how businesses are run. Like, say that tomorrow I invent a Marty McFly hovercraft skateboard. In that situation, I wouldn't wait 20 years until I'd sold enough DFTBA posters to build my Marty McFly hoverboard factory. I would just borrow the money and build the factory immediately so I could start selling hoverboards and swim in a sea of $100 bills. Actually, I would not swim in a sea of $100 bills. I would hoverboard over that sea. Businesses spend more than they bring in all the time. As well they should, and almost all economists agree that governments are similar. There are times when they need to run deficits. For instance, during a recession, government revenue goes down because wages stagnate and unemployment goes up, but government expenditures have to go up, like on unemployment benefits, for instance. So just to be clear, deficits are not inherently evil, and our current debt, while it is very large, does not pose a threat to the American economy because we can pay it back with relative ease.
Rich countries have protected their agricultural markets while foreign poor countries open theirs, leading to dumping and flooding of products, driving local people out of businesses and livelihoods.
What if our debt stopped being cheap? What if people stop believing that the US is the safest place to put their money and they start to buy bonds in, I don't know, like Brazil or China or Germany? Well, that would be very bad, because most years we run a budget deficit, and so we would need to keep borrowing money at these higher interest rates, which would necessitate more deficits and therefore more borrowing at progressively higher interest rates. And then we'd have to cut spending, which would slow growth, and raise taxes, which would slow growth more, and then Greece. better way to cut the deficit is to close the gap between what we take in and what we spend. And in times of economic expansion, this is actually quite easy because the tax base grows and the amount of money people make goes up, so they pay more taxes, so we can just have surpluses, as we did in the 1990s. But during slow recoveries, like the one we have right now, it is much more complicated. So like both President Obama and Governor Romney favored unspecified spending cuts, Governor Romney also favors a tax cut of 20% across the board, whereas President Obama thinks that we should increase taxes by rolling back the Bush-era tax cut on income over $250,000. Neither of these plans is likely to eliminate the deficit, although again, the deficit doesn't necessarily need to be eliminated, and no matter what political rhetoric you hear, neither of these plans is terribly radical either. President Obama wants to put the top marginal income tax rate at 39%. It was over 50% every year from 1945 until 1986. Mitt Romney wants to cut that tax rate to 28.5%, which is where it was in 1989. We can argue thoughtfully about what our policy position should be, but amid all the rhetoric and decontextualized statistics, I just want to underscore that while deficit reduction is important, it is not a crisis.